Hello, I'm Una Cunningham. I'm going to talk about the problem that some people experience motivating reluctant children to speak the minority language. Now, this is about families where more than one language is spoken, and sometimes you have a situation where the adults are speaking the minority language and the children are answering in the majority language. Here in New Zealand, that would mean that maybe a parent is speaking to the child in Samoan or in Chinese, and the child is answering in English. Because of course what we all want is a harmonious bilingual development for our children. So there are a number of reasons why a child might be reluctant to speak the minority language, and that might be that they feel that they have a lack of proficiency. They're not good enough at speaking the language. It might also be a lack of necessity. They don't have any need to speak the language because the people around them actually do speak the majority language, and the child is able to get away with not speaking the minority language. Children have strong will, and we don't want to trample their will unnecessarily. The child might feel it's quite important to be able to choose themselves what language they use. They might be afraid of being mocked or told off if they speak the minority language. The parents might also be keen to let the child really have that decision themselves. And in some cases, the child might have had some negative experiences. Maybe some older relative visiting from the home country pointed out some problem with their pronunciation, or maybe they were looked at strangely by somebody in a shop when they spoke the minority language in public. There can be a lot of reasons why children might not like to do that. One of the things that we can do to help children speak their heritage language is to make sure that they're actually getting enough input in the language. That means that they need to be hearing an appropriate variety of the target language, and that probably is going to be the variety of the target language that parent speaks, the one that is closest to the family. This might be more than one variety or more than one language. For example, Northern Irish English isn't the same as North American English. They also need to be hearing the language from people who they're good at using the language, they're good at speakers of the language, they have confidence in their own ability to speak the language. So that refers to the parents or carers, the adults who are speaking the language to the child. The child also needs to have opportunities to hear and read a lot of the language, enough of it. That can be really difficult if there are more than two languages involved. For older children, above preschool age, they also really need to have contacts outside the family, where they can also hear the minority language spoken or used. And they need also to see and hear the language outside the home. And that's one of the things that's quite important in what we call the linguistic landscape. Seeing the language, being visible in the surroundings, hearing it from time to time. Just to realise that it's not some strange thing that happens just in their family. There are some strategies that can be used. One of them is immersion in the family language. Perhaps you can have some visiting family members coming, and so the child is actually hearing a lot of the minority language and less of the majority language for a while. Another strategy is access to other children, and that can be done in a very informal way, maybe with visiting other families, or perhaps with community schools, community language schools, if there are such things around. It might also be access to culture. If there's a community of speakers of the language, there might be community festivals. This can be very motivating for children. One important thing I find is access to monolinguals, to people who don't speak the majority language, at least not very well. And that can be achieved by visiting relatives. Maybe cousins can visit from the home country, or even just Skyping them, using technology to communicate with the family back home. These things are really important because they are situations where the minority language is the only possible language to use. Digital technology can be helpful in other ways as well, such as books or CDs or movies or online clips, programs, YouTube, TV on demand, radio on demand. All of these things are possible. Audiobooks can be very popular with young people who perhaps don't read very quickly in the minority language but are able to understand the spoken word very well. It really all comes down to language policy, and language policy can be at any level. There are different ways that families can organise the way they use languages at home. One way is that one parent speaks one language and the other language is spoken by the other parent. That's called one person, one language, and that's very common in families where the parents don't share the language. Another way of organising things is to speak the minority language at home and perhaps the majority language outside the home. Families will find different ways of organising their languages, and this has sometimes been referred to as the family language policy. Sort of who speaks what language to whom, when, and what situations. Children will react to family language policy in various ways. Of course, the way a child's family does things is the most natural thing in the world for the child. But there can be situations when the child is really reluctant to use the minority language. And if one parent represents that language, you might have a situation where the child will actually avoid that parent just to avoid speaking the language. And of course that's horrible. The child might also answer in the majority language. And we'll look at some ideas about what you might do about that. But you do want to ideally have the child using the minority language actively if possible at all. Schools will also have language policies. What language is allowed in the classroom, what language is allowed in the break, who is allowed to speak what language to whom. These are all questions that are quite important for the child. So there are strategies then that you might use for making the language necessary to the child, because really feeling that you need to use the language is a huge factor. You need to be motivated. It needs to be justified to make the extra effort from the child's perspective. So one thing that a lot of parents do is that they pretend that they don't understand when the child speaks the majority language. And, well, people feel very differently about that. I think it can be overdone. It can be really frustrating for a child not to be heard, not to be acknowledged when they have something that they really want to communicate. And from the child's perspective, which language they do it in isn't the point if they've got something urgent to tell. And parents and carers really have to and do think a lot about this, how to react to this. And it's one strategy that can have a place in a playful manner sometimes, perhaps. Another more positive approach is using recasts, so that if the child says something in the majority language, then the parent agrees, yes, and then says it in the minority language, so they accept what the child says. I can take an example from Swedish, which is the language that my children had as the majority language. So if they asked me something in Swedish, if they said, "Can we go och hälsa på Johan? Can we go and visit Johan?" Then I would say, "Oh, yeah, we can go and visit Johan." So that I would totally accept what they said. I wouldn't comment on it being in the wrong language, but I would just put it into the appropriate language from my perspective. So making sure that I was filling in any actual linguistic gaps, but also continuing the communication. And that feels like a quite good way of doing it. Another strategy to make it easier for the child to use the language would be scripting. By that I mean sort of giving the child chunks of language to say. So if you want to set them up to, for example, ask a relative something in the minority language, you might say, "Go and tell Auntie that tea's ready." You can say, "Nu är det mat," for example, if it was Swedish was the language. You give them the words in the minority language to say, so they don't need to struggle for that. Other things that people have tried are various kinds of role play games. Let's pretend that we're a fairy story or whatever. One thing that people have had is a puppet. Teachers often use this strategy in Sweden teaching English. There's a puppet who comes out who only speaks English. One notable case is Pricken, the Swedish kitten. That's the case where a Swedish-speaking family got a kitten and told the children that the kitten only speaks Swedish. And that could be a hugely motivating factor for a child who wants to talk to the kitten. The one thing that does come up again and again in our interviews is the idea of regret, that people who don't actually continue to speak the minority language with their children do regret it. And children who don't actually end up being able to speak the minority language regret that they can't, because it can be quite an important thing for them further down the road. Really, it is quite easy to raise a child speaking more than one language. It's the most natural thing in the world. You simply the language to the child and give them an opportunity to use it. This is something we all know how to do with the child's first language. We don't hesitate. To sum up here, strategies for motivating children to want to speak the minority language: to make sure children have enough input and interaction in the minority language from the very beginning. Don't wait. Avoid letting children make decisions with consequences they do not understand. This is the case of the 2-year-old or 4-year-old who digs their heels in and doesn't want to know anything about the minority language. They will be sorry later. It's hard to argue with a young child, but we don't let young children make other important decisions about what they eat, or about how they behave near danger. So we might actually press this issue a little bit more in some cases. Arrange meetings with other children who use the language. Other children are very interesting, and it can be nice to, if the children, especially if they're monolinguals, it can be easy to get the children speaking the language together. But the one thing that I personally believe is that the relationship between siblings isn't the parents' affair, really. That I would advise to let the siblings use whatever language they choose together. It would be nice if they used the minority language, but I don't think it's really the parents' call. So that's really all I have to say about this topic, but we do have more information available on these pages. Do like our Facebook page, Growing Up with Two Languages, and we hope to see you again in another video.